subject of study. So I'd like for us to consider and learn a little bit about this approach and think about how it might have useful connections to L2 writing, but also to English language teaching, more broadly speaking. As in yesterday's presentation, I will use some terms just to refresh your memory real quick. L2, English as a second language. That's what I mean when I say L2. L1, English as a first language, native English-speaking students. L2 writing classes versus L1 writing classes. L2 writing classes, when I say that, I mean ESL or EFL classes. When I say L1 writing classes, I mean mainstream college writing classes designed for L1 students traditionally, even though some L2 students take the classes. Now, as I told you, I focused on myself last time. I thought it would be nice as kind of a first part of this presentation to get to know you a little bit in the form of a little survey. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a few questions. Don't worry, it doesn't involve you talking or anything like that. But you can answer by raising your hand. And when you raise your hand, keep it up for a little while so I can kind of look out and see how many people have said yes to the question. Okay? So the first one's a pretty easy question, and I'm expecting a lot of yeses, but I could be surprised, but let's see. Number one, do you identify yourself as a language teacher? If it's yes, raise your hand. Okay, that's some of us. Not as many as I was expecting, but a good number of us. Okay, good, good, good. All right, here's question 2. Do you identify yourself as an English language teacher? Raise your hand. I think there are more hands on this one. If you said yes to this one, then I think you should say yes to the first one, no? Okay. All right, good, good. All right. Do you teach a variety of English language skills? So you teach many different aspects of English, grammar, reading, kind of everything. Raise your hand if you would say yes to that. Okay, kind of what I would expect. Do you teach English grammar? And what I mean by that is a whole class focused on English grammar or as a significant part of a class. So you would consider yourself an English grammar teacher. Raise your hand. Still some of us, but not as many, and that's what I would expect. Do you teach listening? Okay, same question, but this skill, listening. Okay, some. These questions are almost over, I promise. Do you teach speaking or pronunciation? I've kind of linked them together. Okay, some of us. Do you teach reading? All right. You can guess what the last one is probably. Do you teach writing? Well, more than I thought, okay? Thank you for participating in that. What I was expecting was the yeses to get less and less and less as we went through the questions. But I'm encouraged to see that a lot of you consider yourself writing teachers. And the reason I say that is that traditionally speaking, writing has not really been a major part of English language teaching. For much of the early history of English language teaching, writing was kind of an afterthought, not even thought about, actually. In order to provide some context for this and where I'm going in this presentation, I'm going to very briefly talk about how the teaching of writing has unfortunately been seen until recently as secondary to or even less important than other aspects of English language teaching. As some or many of you might already know, English language teaching developed as an organized profession in the late 1940s and 50s. Did you know that? As an organized profession. Of course, English or foreign language teaching and even English language teaching was before this, but as an organized profession. This new profession was largely influenced by the schools of thought of the day, particularly structural linguistics and behavioral psychology. This meant that there was a hierarchy as to what was taught in English language teaching at the beginning, with structural linguistics and behavioral approaches calling for drill-based stimulus recall methods of instruction, most widely seen and used in the audiolingual method. Have you ever heard of the audiolingual method? Okay. It's almost entirely listening and speaking based in the form of drills and repetition. This approach really defined early language teaching. In the 1960s, the field of L1, now remember L1 is first language, English as a first language, a native language. L1 writing studies also began to develop, and it was called composition and rhetoric. Unfortunately, L1 writing scholars saw L2 writing issues and L2 students as an English language teaching issue and didn't focus on second language writers at all. And with L2 English language teaching, not focusing on L2 writers, L2 students and writing was kind of ignored by the two professions. These are the early days. The result is that ever since English language teaching became an official profession, that's what I'm trying to say, writing was not part of it. This changed in 1966 when an English language teacher and scholar named Robert Kaplan published an article called Cultural Thought Patterns in Intercultural Education. Have you ever heard of Robert Kaplan? Anyone? Okay, cool. Then I can tell you something that I think is really interesting. This article was based on Kaplan's analysis of writing by L2 students coming from different regions around the world. So he looked at the writing of these L2 students and analyzed it. The point of the article was to show that writing style, structure, and pattern are not universal, but are instead culturally dependent. In other words, what is called good writing in one culture and language, for that matter, may not be considered good writing in another culture or language. And so in his study, he analyzed 5 different cultural writing patterns. And here's a very brief overview of Kaplan's analysis. Kaplan identified English as having a linear or straight line pattern, meaning that English writing is considered direct and focused, having a single main point and then developed through the text, through the writing. Middle Eastern writing, or Semitic as Kaplan called it, remember he was writing in the 60s, so he was using some language we probably wouldn't use today. But he called it Semitic writing, and it follows a parallel structure with ideas being stated and then the same idea being stated kind of again, and then stated a third time, and repeating. And you'll see this format in the Bible. In fact, he cites the Bible in his article as an example of this kind of writing. A lot of Asian writing, Kaplan calls it Oriental writing. That's a term we wouldn't use today. If you want to know why, I can talk to you about that afterward, but it's the 60s, so it was accepted then. But we would say Asian writing tends to focus on being, A, really respectful to whomever or whatever is being written about, and also indirect. And so he used this pattern, this circular pattern, to give the message that writing in Asian countries and Asian cultures tends to avoid the main point until the very end. And so it's kind of this circular pattern. And finally, well, not finally, there's 2 more, for Romance languages, and Romance languages include Spanish, of course. Kaplan says that the writing often digresses, and so that's why he's got this diagrammed as kind of not a straight line, but going off topic a little bit, and then coming back into focus. There are a lot of Spanish speakers here. Do you agree with this assessment, that it's acceptable to a certain degree to kind of go off topic a little bit and then come back on? Maybe, maybe not. Huh? It could be relevant for English, meaning? Right. Is that acceptable? Yeah. Kaplan is saying it is. We can debate that maybe, okay? Cultural, right. He's also saying that about Russian, and he gives these little brackets here because he's also saying that grammatically speaking, there's a lot of difference as well. So in addition to digressing, Kaplan is saying that Russian writers also tend to have really short sentences followed by really long sentences followed by really short sentences, so there's kind of this rhythm is thrown off. Okay, so that's Kaplan's article. He even included these diagrams in the article, and so the article famously became known as Kaplan's doodles. Do you know what a doodle is? It's a little drawing, right? Okay. I think Kaplan's message is quite significant because it's showing us that understanding the cultural thought patterns behind writing can help us understand the point of the writing. But Kaplan's article got a lot of criticism and still does to this day. Can you guess why this article was criticized? Maybe you can. One criticism was that English writing, in being presented as linear, direct, focused, clear, was presented as the best form of writing, right? Clearly, this is how everyone should learn to write. And all the other examples had a flaw of some kind. That was sort of the atmosphere of the article. So that was sort of criticized, okay? Because it seemed like it was an indirect way of presenting English as the premier way. This is the approach that everyone should have. Another criticism of Kaplan's article is that taking it literally and even trying to adapt what he's saying in a writing classroom, well, it can be hard to do that, but if you try to adapt it directly in a writing classroom, that can quickly lead to stereotyping students, right? So for example, if an L2 writing teacher has some Korean or Japanese students and automatically assumes that they're going to write in this indirect fashion, and a student from, say, Mexico is going to write in this off-topic fashion, that's quickly going to lead to some stereotyping, which is bad in and of itself, but it's also going to lead the teacher to ignore the student's real writing issues and not focus on how the student is actually writing. But despite this criticism, the article is still considered a very significant contribution to the field of English language teaching. Why? Because it prompted a new focus on writing within the field, something that hadn't happened before. And writing, ESL and L2 writers in general were being ignored in mainstream writing, so this was a good turn of events. Kaplan's article led to a lot more research on this particular idea, and a new field emerged, L2 writing studies in the 1970s. Scholars and teachers began to focus on writing as an important part of English language teaching. And remember that since the writers were being ignored in L1 teaching, in L1 scholarship, this was really the first time that L2 writing was even given any kind of attention. So the two fields, L2 and L1 writing, developed really quite independently, and there was a huge gap between the two, with L2 writers being ignored for a long time, and then finally through people like Kaplan being addressed. Okay, my own research. Yesterday I spoke about uncertainty. This was actually, I think, an effect of this gap between the two fields. I talked yesterday about not feeling part of English language teaching and not really feeling part of writing. And I think that's because of this gap that emerged in the separation of the scholarship. So when I was in graduate school, I decided to focus on L2 writers in a L1 writing class, and I was able to turn my uncertainty into scholarship. And now I'm comfortable saying I'm both a language teacher and a writing teacher, but I still feel this gap. At Andrews University, where I teach L2 writing classes in the English language program, CIEP, Center for Intensive English. And I teach L1 writing classes in the English department. And I still see on a regular basis this gap. So the L2 teachers, they teach the ESL writing, but they really don't collaborate with the L1 teachers, the mainstream writing teachers, and vice versa. So even in my school, I see this gap continuing. I thought a good project, because of this gap, because of my interest in this, I decided that a good project would be to evaluate textbooks, L2 writing textbooks and L1 writing textbooks, textbooks that are used in classes, to see if this gap, this difference in attention and teaching was reflected in the materials that teachers actually use in the classroom. So I got 3 L2 writing textbooks that I know are commonly used in many universities, and I got 3 L1 writing textbooks that I know are commonly used at colleges and universities. And I analyzed them, and I'm not going to go into the details of that for the sake of time, but I used a method called qualitative content analysis to compare and contrast these textbooks. I'll save the details of what I did, the methodology and all of that, for another presentation and hopefully upcoming publications this year. But I would like you to focus today in this presentation on one major finding from that research. And that major finding is this. L2 writing textbooks, at least the ones that I analyzed, presented writing as a series of skills to be learned in a building block-like fashion. The message about writing in these textbooks seemed to be that once these skills were mastered, then they could be used in almost any writing situation. So learn these building blocks, and then you can put them together, and then voila, you can go write in almost any situation. Okay. The L1 writing textbooks, on the other hand, focused far more on writing as a social act. While both grammar and specific writing skills were presented in these L1 writing textbooks, the focus was far more on writing as a process of paying attention to specific writing situations and making decisions about writing based on the purpose for those specific situations. So a key difference is writing was presented in the L1 writing textbooks as not universal, not something you could learn and apply in all these different writing situations. The L2 textbooks presented writing as a series of skills to be learned. I'm going back to that. Typically, this included the mastering of paragraph structure first. That's one of the key building blocks. And then moving on to essay structure. The essay structure, often including 5 paragraphs, seemed to be the driving force, the key overarching idea that was being taught. And I've outlined it here. If you've been in my workshops, my 2 workshops this week, you'll recognize this. And even if you haven't, I think many of you will still recognize this. But really, it's an introduction, body, conclusion. The introduction has a hook that draws readers in, background information on the topic, and then the so important thesis statement, the main argument that sets the focus of the entire essay. The body paragraphs, usually there are 2 or 3 typically, that's why it's called the 5-paragraph essay, has a topic sentence connecting to the thesis statement, and each topic sentence is developed through details and examples, and then there's a concluding sentence, and at the end is a conclusion where the thesis is restated, main ideas are summarized, and maybe a final thought is given. So the L2 writing textbooks presented a philosophy of writing that focuses on mastering specific writing skills that lead to a common essay structure, as diagrammed here. Does this look familiar? I mean, have you ever taught this or written in this way? You can raise your hands. Okay, some of us. Does this also kind of look like what Kaplan was talking about? Kind of this linear, straight line. Direct, here's my point. Now I'm developing my point. Now I'm summarizing my point. The L1 writing textbooks in my project, on the other hand, tended to present writing less as a series of building blocks and more as a social act. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I observed a philosophy in the L1 writing textbook that I refer to as a writing about writing in this presentation. The writing about writing philosophy was presented as a specific teaching approach in one of the L1 writing textbooks. So it's an actual approach. The name of the book is Writing About Writing. But I really saw that philosophy throughout all three of the books that I analyzed. And closely related to the writing about writing philosophy is the importance of the rhetorical situation, a concept that was also prevalent in the three L1 writing textbooks. The rhetorical situation is often depicted as a triangle of three related components: the author, the purpose, and the audience. These three interconnected components create the parameters for the message that's being communicated or attempted in the writing. In other words, who an author is and where that author has come from determines how the author writes. Equally as important is the specific purpose of the writing in a particular situation. For instance, should the writing persuade? Should it inform? Should it summarize? Should it argue a specific point? And so on. There are many different purposes. And finally, the audience who will read what is written determines the best language to use, the ideal tone, and the kinds of information and examples to include. So author, purpose, and audience all interconnect to create a specific message that a particular piece of writing communicates or is intended to communicate. This concept was a major part of the writing about writing philosophy I observed in the three L1 writing textbooks. So to summarize my writing textbook analysis project, in comparing L2 writing textbooks and L1 writing textbooks, two very different philosophies of writing and teaching of writing emerged. This very much corresponds to the gap I was talking about in the two fields. Okay? But what exactly does writing about writing mean? Because what I'm going to ultimately say in today's presentation, in the few minutes that we have left, is that even though writing about writing is very much a mainstream L1 concept, L1 writing concept, there are aspects of this that I think are super useful to L2 writing, things that will help us as English language teachers and those of us who focus on teaching writing. But what does writing about writing actually mean? Okay, I told you yesterday in my presentation that teaching grammar used to intimidate me. It's still not something I really enjoy, but I'm going to attempt, at least invite you to help me. So writing about writing, okay, if we have this up here, and we want to look at the parts of speech, let's start with the second writing over here. What part of speech is that? I'll give you a hint. It depends. Okay, it could be a true noun, right? Or it could be a gerund, right? So it could be a noun form of a verb. Okay, when we say writing about writing, that's really what we're talking about, the gerund form of writing. So the act of writing, okay, that's what we mean. About, we know what that is, right? That is a preposition, okay? What about the first writing? Well, that could be a gerund again. So in that sense, the meaning of writing about writing is the act of writing about the act of writing, okay? And that's definitely what a writing about writing approach is. But a writing about writing approach also includes the noun, the true noun form of writing, meaning what's the true noun form of writing? That's writing as a thing, right? So written texts. So writing about writing also includes the act of reading written texts about the act of writing. Okay? So, in a writing about writing approach, in a writing about writing approach, both interpretations apply. Students in a writing about writing class read journal articles and other published material that focus on writing and the nature of writing. But also, students complete writing assignments that focus on their own writing experiences and what they are learning in real time from reading about writing in the class. Are you following this, or did I totally lose you on all these definitions? Hopefully you're still with me, okay? A writing about writing class therefore focuses on writing as the subject, just like a math class focuses on math. It focuses on writing as a subject of study. At this point in my talk today, I'd like to clarify that I'm not suggesting L2 writing classes follow a complete writing about writing approach or use this textbook or anything like that. I mean, that would not be appropriate. This is designed for students who are at a college level of English and they are studying writing in a mainstream college setting, which many L2 students ultimately get to, but this would not be a book to teach in like an ESL program. What I am suggesting is some of the approaches and the philosophy behind this could be very useful to an L2 ESL or EFL class. At Andrews University, the L1 writing program, the mainstream writing program, follows a writing about writing approach. And I work closely with the director in this program, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how writing about writing can help our ESL students, L2 writers. So I'd like to share now, in closing, I'm getting close, closing, 3 specific aspects of a writing about writing approach that I believe can be very useful to L2 writers in an L2 writing class. Number 1, encourage L2 students to reflect on their own writing experiences and their attitudes about writing. This first aspect that's relevant from writing about writing to an L2 class is using reflection as a teaching methodology. Reflection is a central part of a writing about writing approach because it is an easy way for writing students to begin thinking about studying writing as a subject. In L1 writing about writing classes, students often keep what we call a writing journal to reflect on their personal experiences with writing and their changing attitudes about writing as they're taking the class. Having L2 students in L2 writing classes reflect on their own writing, particularly writing experiences in their first language and their attitudes about writing in English, can be an effective early activity in L2 writing classes that can help students see their own writing as a subject of study. Another writing about writing strategy that writing teachers use in L2 writing classes specifically is to have students read and reflect on published writing by authors from similar cultures and linguistic backgrounds as the students. This can provide students with evidence and opportunities to see that real published writers of English, in fact, come from their own backgrounds or similar backgrounds. And this can be very inspiring. Finally, encouraging students to revise their writing, perhaps by giving a new grade on revised assignments, can help students reflect on their writing with meaning. If they're doing it because they get a new grade, they'll be motivated to reflect on their own writing. As the students keep a writing journal throughout the class and read about writing, particularly writing coming from their own language and culture, their attitudes about writing, their understanding of writing will change, and they can use that new knowledge to revise assignments that they did before they started getting that knowledge or earlier in the class. Several chapters in a new scholarly book about writing called Next Steps, New Directions in and for Writing About Writing have focused on L2 writing and writers. Writing teachers from around the world, okay, not from the US, but from around the world, have contributed to this book. and they've shared their own experiences using reflection as a key tool in their writing classes. One of the teachers, named Grant, observes that many of the L2 students in her L1 writing class assume that their previous writing experiences, particularly those in their home language, their home culture, are not important, and in fact something to kind of leave behind as they are studying and learning to write in English. This teacher intentionally asks students to reflect on their past writing experiences, even those defined by negativity and lack of confidence. She then has students read about successful published writers and the struggles and lack of confidence that these writers had to work through to become successful. In this way, her students can begin to see that their own complex and perhaps negative feelings about writing are legitimate and even necessary to grow as writers. Wilson, Jackson, and Vera are three other teachers who teach many Spanish-speaking L2 students in a university in Texas. These teachers intentionally have students read Spanish-speaking authors who, in both English and in Spanish, published articles and books about overcoming racial and linguistic prejudice, particularly the thinking that English is superior to the many dialects of Spanish that these students speak. In this way, these teachers hope to correct deficit thinking. That is the thinking that the students' home cultures and languages and dialects are inferior and must be abandoned when learning in English, when learning to write in English and when learning English in general. Finally, Hart is a writing teacher who asks L2 students to reflect on writing by describing challenges related to writing through cultural metaphors. For instance, one of her students from Korea explained how writing is like learning to make homemade kimchi. Have you ever had kimchi? Okay, do you like kimchi? Okay. It's probably the national dish, the most famous dish from Korea, but it's really hard to make. It's hard to get right. So this student's point was like making kimchi, learning to write has to be done over and over and over and over and over again before you get it right, before you get something that's edible. Okay? So this teacher uses metaphors like this and has students come up with metaphors from their own culture to explain writing challenges. So, reflection is a central part of a writing about writing approach, and reflection activities, such as the ones these teachers describe, can help L2 writers see that their previous writing experiences, including those in their home culture and language, are legitimate, they're valuable, and they actually help them in their learning of English and to write in English. A second aspect of writing about writing that is relevant to the L2 writing classroom focuses on the rhetorical situation. Specifically, L2 writing teachers can help L2 students see writing as a part of a greater rhetorical situation or context, this triangle. L2 writing teachers can use this situation, this triangle, even as a supplement to teaching a traditional 5-paragraph essay presented in many L2 writing textbooks. By simply having students study this and understand this can help students begin to see that writing is not something that happens in a vacuum, but is something that is a social act and depends on more than just themselves. And this quickly leads me to my third and perhaps most significant aspect of writing about writing that can be used in an L2 writing class. Encourage L2 students to read challenging journal articles and book chapters about writing. The point here is not to turn an L2 writing class, especially lower levels, intermediate, basic levels, into a scholarly reading class that will quickly overwhelm L2 students. However, L2 writing teachers can strategically choose readings about writing that can help students see the bigger picture in regard to writing in general and in regard to their own specific journey as a writer. The rhetorical triangle can serve as a good guideline for choosing readings. L2 writing teachers can choose supplemental readings that focus on author, purpose, and audience. For example, I have my advanced level L2 students at Andrews read scholarly articles about L2 writers, their experiences, their struggles, and their successes as a way of reflecting on the multiple identities that define L2 writers as authors. Vivian Zamel, Ilona Lakey are two writers that really focus on this issue, and I have my students read some of their work, and we talk about it. In regard to purpose, I have my advanced level L2 writers, critically reflect on the classic 5-paragraph essay structure, the Kaplan's linear model, and then I encourage them to explore other ways that writers in English structure their writing. They quickly see that the 5-paragraph essay doesn't really show up in a lot of authentic published writing in English. Kaplan's article is a good reading for this. John Swales is another author. He focuses on genre analysis, which gives a roadmap for looking at different kinds of writing and gives students a tool for analyzing different kinds of writing. And then Dana Ferris and John Hedgecock wrote a book called Teaching L2 Writing that gets into many of these issues as well. Finally, for audience, I really want my students to understand that writing does not happen in a vacuum. In other words, it's not a solitary act. To understand this, I have students read about different theoretical ways that situations of writing can be understood and described. In L1 writing studies, the discourse community model is common. In L2 scholarship, not just writing, but applied linguistics and other aspects of foreign language teaching, scholarship in these areas focus on communities of practice. Don't worry if you're not sure what that means. Basically, it's a way of conceptualizing community and how communities shape writing. So reading a little bit in this area helps students start to see that writing is a social act, and writing, good writing, really depends on audience. Now that was a lot of information, and perhaps it was overwhelming, and I hope not. But on the subject of being overwhelmed, perhaps you're wondering, isn't it too challenging for L2 writers, particularly EFL students, to read this heavy stuff like this, to read articles published in journals that are all in English? This is actually a common question and concern for teachers who are thinking about using a writing about writing approach. And in this book that I was citing, one of the teachers commented on using the writing about writing approach in Qatar, okay, a country in the Middle East, where all of the students were L2 students, and the teacher used this approach. And the teacher's colleagues were concerned. I don't think the students can handle reading these articles. So when she first used the approach, she was concerned, and as a way of sort of gauging how the students were doing, she gave her first class, using this approach, a series of surveys just to check in and see how they were dealing with the readings. And then after she taught the class, it seemed to go well, so she kept teaching this approach in the class, and after a year or so, she was giving the survey every class for a good year or so, just to see how it was working. Here are some of the comments that the L2 students who took her classes wrote on the surveys. I have never read a book with readings about writing that is more effective than writing about writing. I now see life as a rhetorical situation. The concept of the rhetorical triangle and its components will forever influence my writing. Okay, these are L2 students writing this. And I think I skipped some more. Yeah, these were the first ones. I strongly recommend writing about writing for every student. Writing about writing is a powerful tool to improve students' reading and writing abilities. So the L2 students, at least in this teacher's classes, were really drawn to this approach. All right, in conclusion, as I did in my first presentation yesterday, I want to connect what I'm saying to the three themes of this conference: be upright, be a missionary, and be innovative. I want to especially focus on being innovative. You see, I think adapting and strategically using an approach like writing about writing in L2 writing classes is innovative, okay? It's thinking outside the box for a few reasons. First, a writing about writing approach in L2 writing classes can help build a bridge between academic fields of L2 and L1 writing studies. Remember I talked about this gap? Well, saying, hey, I'm not afraid to go over and use a methodology over on that side, on this side, I think is the way to bridge the two fields, because of both L2 and L1 writing as fields, as academic scholarship, the two have a lot to learn from each other, and it's a shame that over the years there hasn't been that connection. So I think this is one way to do that. Furthermore, it's important to realize that the field of L2 writing studies, arguably starting with Kaplan, is rooted in a writing about writing approach. I think this is a bit ironic, but what Kaplan was doing in this study by analyzing writing and then writing about his analysis of writing is writing about writing. And my point here is this is already a part of the field of L2 writing studies. So it's not something wildly different than what's already been going on. Another way that writing about writing is innovative is that writing about writing is a way to connect L2 writing with the rest of English language teaching. Again, I'm talking about bridge building, but this time bridge building within the field of English language teaching. You'll recall that writing was not really important in the early days. And it's really still not absolutely a core part of English language teaching. A writing about writing approach, I think, can begin to connect writing more to other aspects of English language teaching. For instance, the rhetorical triangle, this idea of writing as a social act, if you think about it and really analyze this approach, it's very much in line with what's called the communicative approach that's defined English language teaching for the last, 30 years now, maybe even more. And really, the 5-paragraph essay and teaching writing as a formula to plug in information and use in all situations is really not part of a communicative approach. So a writing about writing approach fits nicely with other philosophies in other aspects of English language teaching. Moreover, a writing about writing approach helps connect writing to key concepts in second language acquisition scholarship. For example, 3 of the teachers in the book that I cited a few minutes ago, the teachers who work with Spanish-speaking students at a university in Texas, point out the following. This is a quote from their chapter. Given the opportunity to read and write about scholarship that is relevant to their own writing lives, L2 students begin to think of themselves as writers. They begin to think strategically about what they can do with writing. This makes sense, of course, as Stephen Krashen's theory of the effective filter posits. As individuals' self-confidence and motivation increase and their writing anxiety decreases, they are better able to acquire a second language. In conclusion, writing about writing is sound pedagogy. A writing about a writing approach also helps build bridges between L2 and L1 writing and within English language teaching. And these bridges help situate L2 writing in its natural place as a field that simultaneously addresses both writing and language learning in just the same way that I've come to terms with my teaching identity as a language teacher and a writing teacher. A writing about writing approach in L2 writing classes, therefore, is innovative teaching. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Okay,